8 years had passed since Super Metroid. A lot had happened in that time. The Nintendo 64 released, bringing with it the next evolution of gaming, 3D. Many games were making their jump from one dimension to another, bringing in a new era of gaming that Metroid missed out on. Sadly, Samus did not have her own game to speak of on Nintendo's next big console. Outside of her appearance in Super Smash Bros., it wouldn't be until the next generation that we'd get not one, but 2 new games in the Metroid series. Samus's first foray into the third dimension by a new team, causing a bit of uncertainty amongst fans, as well as the next mainline 2D game of Nintendo's big handheld at the time, the Game Boy Advance. Enter Metroid Fusion. While I have had my fair share of time spent on the previous 3 games we've discussed on this season, they pale in comparison to the amount of time I've sunk into Fusion. I played it on my GBA growing up, made it fairly far, but kept getting stuck at one part or another. It wasn't until the game was given to early 3DS adopters through the Ambassador program that I'd finally see the game through to the end and declare it as one of the greats. I've since played the game a few dozen times from start to finish and have considered it to be among some of the greatest games the GBA offers. This is the first time that I'm going into one of these reviews with a more personal attachment to a game, and as such, I'm going to try not to let rose-tinted glasses affect my viewpoint. As it turns out, the Metroids were created by the Chozo, as their name translates to Ultimate Warrior in their own language. Why were they created? To protect the surface of SR-388 from a parasite known as the X. Unfortunately, due to Samus laying waste and eradicating the last of the Metroids, the X have begun to propagate the planet once again. Following the destruction of planet Zebes in Super Metroid, the Galactic Federation hired Samus to assist in an excavation of SR-388. The story goes out of its way to emphasize how much Samus despises the planet, and she's about to hate it even more. Upon defeating a native creature blocking the path, an X-parasite flies out of the corpse and immediately enters Samus. Thinking nothing of it, Samus returns to her ship, and before long, the X enters her central nervous system, infecting her in the process. Samus is immediately knocked out and her iconic ship drifts off into an asteroid field, destroying it in the process. Thanks to the auto-eject, the comatose Samus is saved and brought back to the Galactic Federation. The X has fused itself with Samus's power suit, and while the Federation amputates parts of it off, it's not enough. Samus is on the brink of death. Thankfully for Samus, there is a solution. Harvested cells from the Metroid hatchling were on standby and immediately are injected into her central nervous system. The X are eradicated from her body, saving her. What I like about this opening, and as we'll progress the game itself, is the deep look we get into Samus as a character. We get to hear her thoughts on the situation she finds herself in, and this line always gets to me.
As for me, one life ended, yet I survived, reborn as something different. Pondering this fact, I realize I owe the Metroid hatchling my life twice over.
Previously, Samus was always presented as a silent protagonist. Super short opening dialogue aside. The truth of the matter is, we never truly understood how she felt toward the baby Metroid she spared until now. She seemed to have formed a bond with it whether she intended to or not. It really makes the impact of its death all the more chilling. Can we take a moment to discuss the alteration of Samus's design? It was a very bold move to drastically alter her appearance. It sets the stage for the many changes Fusion brings to the traditional Metroid formula. Speaking of Metroid, now that Samus has been injected with the Metroid cells, her biology has changed to that of a Metroid. She's now a cross of a human, Chozo, and a Metroid all in one. Samus receives a distress call from the nearby BSL station and heads off to explore. This station has been experimenting and studying the lifeforms of SR-388, and there's been an explosion on deck. The explosion apparently awoke a nameless fear in Samus's heart. There's a new side of vulnerability to her. Now that she lacks her iconic power suit, she's feeling weaker and more exposed, and in a matter of time, so too will the player. Samus is fitted with a new ship, but due to not only her condition, but also the nature of the BSL research, she'll be taking orders from an AI. Samus notes that this is the first time she's taking orders since her former commanding officer, Adam Malkovich, who she names the AI after. Just like Super Metroid, this opening can't be skipped, but unlike Super, there are some drastic differences in how the story is presented to the player. In Super, outside of that single instance, the story was told through subtext and gameplay. Here in Fusion, there are many instances of dialogue throughout the entire game. A controversial change to say the least, but one I don't necessarily mind. Unlike previous entries, Fusion has a story to tell and a set order it wants to tell it to the player. What this means is that even the gameplay has been changed drastically. It's not uncommon for doors to shut behind you, preventing you from going back to places you've been. You are always told where to go. No longer are you forging a path for yourself and discovering areas in your own order. Each area also begins with a navigation, save, and recharge station. You get your orders from the navigation room, carry them out, and then report back to receive more orders. Much like the gameplay, you'll notice the environments are also artificial. Where Super had Meridia, a vast underwater cave system, Fusion has a fish tank. Samus now controls more or less the same, but with a bit more weight to her. Her jumps are no longer floaty, a change I'm welcome to as it makes tight platforming much easier to perform. She's also a little bit slower than before, but that might have been due to the screen size. Due to the lack of half the face buttons of the Super Nintendo, the control scheme has been revamped to fit the GBA. Missiles and power bombs are now activated by holding down the R button, making access to them much snappier and allows for a quick change on the fly. Aiming is done with L and tapping up and down to change the direction. Another fantastic change. Gone is the run button, as Samus is always at top speed, meaning that once you get the returning speed booster, you'll reach breakneck speeds as long as you're moving in a straight line for a short period. This may be the only change I'm mixed on. It can become frustrating when you're just trying to move forward and then immediately start speeding through. Otherwise, I don't mind these changes and find them to be a welcome improvement overall. Speaking of new changes, now that Samus has ditched her bulky armor, she's more nimble and can grab ledges. This is a great addition that I'm surprised took this long to show itself. It certainly could have saved me from a few jumps in Super. This does come at the cost of the wall jump functionality. No longer can you use a single wall to scale vertically. It pushes you away from the wall. I don't mind so much as the level design doesn't need to use the wall jump very often, but I can see why other players would be bothered by this alteration. Samus can now climb ladders and monkey bars across the ceiling. Are we sure the lack of the suit is a bad thing? Yes, it does have its drawbacks. Sadly, this means Samus's defense is much lower than before and she'll go down in just a few hits. These are some of the only complaints I have with the game, and I find that they don't hold the game back from being great. It's thanks to this shift in focus that the developers were able to weave a more complex story together. It's about the losses Samus has faced. They could have simply made Super Metroid II and moved on, but they didn't, and I respect the team for their efforts to change things up so drastically. The more linear mission-based system also lends itself well to the pick-up-and-play nature of the Game Boy Advance. This was deliberate, as within several minutes you'll find multiple save rooms. However, just because the game adopted to a more linear system, doesn't mean it's any less of a Metroid game. While the game may tell you where to go, it never tells you how to get there. The map is broken up into different colors to represent where the computer wants you to go versus what you can discover along the way. The maps are definitely much larger than they appear, and so the path from A to B is never what it seems. Though the game does make some rather questionable decisions with progression. How the devs expected you to know that you need to fall through some floors to get behind a locked door is beyond me. Without the X-ray scope, an omission I'm a bit bummed about, you'll be bombing random floors, shooting random ceilings, and just generally bumbling around hoping to find your way to your destination. This doesn't happen often, but when it does, it can be frustrating and bog down the experience. Progression is no longer dictated by which power-ups you have, but utilizing them in creative ways is still present and makes for some satisfying item discovery. I alluded to it earlier, but what sets this game apart from the others and is one of its biggest contenders for its controversy is the game's steep skill curve. The more open a world is to the player, the more likely they are to figure out what they can and can't do at the time. A design choice that the first 3 Metroid games adopted, as they were adventure games. A linear progression gradually ramps up the difficulty over time. Placements of obstacles, enemies, and platforms. This is often done in 2D platformers. This is a system that Fusion adopted and adapted very well. Samus takes much more damage from enemies who scale alongside her, never seeming to drop as much health as they dish out. The scariest part is that enemies can reform as even stronger forms. This is the very nature of the X-Parasites. They copy and replicate the DNA of the creatures they infect and take on not only their appearance, but their skills as well. They're not mindless though. These things can steal the knowledge and memories of their victims. Thankfully for Samus, due to the Metroid DNA, she is completely immune to them. Heck, she can outright absorb them to restore energy, missiles, and even gain power-ups. It's an in-universe explanation for a gameplay feature, and it works! There are 3 types of X to absorb: green for missiles, yellow for health, and red for a full restore. The way the X look is just a wonderful use of sprite work. The entire game has some beautiful sprite work. Fire effects, hazy smears, fading, it's pixel-based art at some of the GBA's finest. When they impersonate their hosts, there's something just off about them enough to give you a sense of unease. The boss is depicted the best. Creepy amalgamations indicative of Samus's lost power-ups. This is in line with the game's theme, as Metroid Fusion is, in fact, a horror game. For reasons unfathomable, the Federation sent the amputated pieces of Samus's suit to the BSL station. Due to this blunder, the X have found a way to mimic her. This is the SAX, Samus Aran X. This absolutely terrifying creature is a representation of Samus at her most powerful, where you are her at her lowest. This unsettling monster lurks around the station, hunting you down. When it's near, and you will know it's near thanks to its unsettling, unmistakable footsteps that haunt the halls. You will have no choice but to hide. To attempt to confront it would be suicide. The SAX is rocking the ice beam, and with Samus's new weakness to ice, thanks to the Metroid DNA, she doesn't stand a chance against it. Actually, if I can use this as an opportunity to segue into the sound design, the GBA is often overlooked for having a more limited sound system compared to that of the Super Nintendo, but Metroid Fusion has some of the best use of the system's capabilities. Bear in mind, this game came out during the GBA's infancy. I previously mentioned the SAX's footsteps, but the punch of a missile colliding with an enemy is just mwah. Though the power bomb detonating is unbearably loud and sounds like a vacuum. This can be overlooked though, as Fusion brings some of the series' best music. Keeping in line with the theming of the game, the music invokes that fear, that isolation, that atmosphere, I'd argue better than the rest. Take the iconic main theme for example. Before, this simple tune started out dreadful, but would change into something more cheerful to invoke hope in the player. Fusion's take on this iconic theme does the exact opposite. Just when you think it's going to reach that hopeful part, it transforms into something more sinister. The haunting nature of the soundtrack doesn't stop there. You'll find that most of the themes have this almost cold, desolate tone to them that invokes fear in the player constantly. But sometimes the soundtrack can also create some truly beautiful pieces that harken back to the atmosphere of Super and melodic approach of the first two. While we're on the subject of Samus's weakened state, let's discuss power-ups. Most of the power-ups are sadly returning ones borrowed from Super Metroid. There are only 2 new power-ups this time around. Ice Missiles, a result of Samus's previously mentioned vulnerability to ice thanks to her Metroid DNA, which actually causes ice variants of the X to attack her, until she gets the Various suit, in which case they flee out of fear of her. A satisfying result of storytelling through gameplay. The other new power-up is the Diffusion Missile. It allows Samus to charge up her missile attack before letting it loose. When it collides with anything, it causes an area effect to spread, freezing everything on the screen. What it lacks in original power-ups, it makes great use of in its few new ones, as well as its returning ones. You might start to find the linear structure of the game repetitive. The game even seems to notice this, as it tells you to return to a room you previously got a power-up from. This was deliberate. Fusion is setting the stage for a change I guarantee nobody saw coming. The SAX disables the station's power, and the entire tone shifts. There's an intense scene where you can hear the SAX below you, but you can't see it. It's not leaving, meaning you have no choice but to drop down and engage it. You're forced to run, narrowly keeping the distance between yourself and this heartless monster. The only reason you were able to escape is because you can grab ledges, something it cannot, something you previously could not. It's indicative of the game's theme. The SAX is what you used to be. Unlike you, it can go where it pleases whenever it wants. You have to take orders and follow a strict path. It's what Samus has lost, and because of its ever-growing presence, you will always be reminded of that. After restoring the power, nothing remains the same. The computer continues to tell Samus what to do, but given the circumstances of the SAX and the damage it causes, you have to go off the beaten path to reach your destinations, leading to the accidental discovery of some of Samus's most powerful abilities. These breaches in protocol lead to Samus getting yelled at by Adam. Samus is taking back her agency and the Federation is not happy. The way the game builds up to this kind of stuff is done beautifully, and it's hardly the only instance. Bosses have build up leading up to their encounters with the bounty hunter. Ceres's remains in a pool of water, indicating the X have already gotten to it. In one area, I saw a shadowy figure flying frantically around in the background. Then when you encounter it, Nightmare, you see how truly powerful the creature is. An X infects the cryo-frozen remains of Ridley, then flies off. Later on, you'll encounter the remains as they reanimate and create Ridley X. Stuff like this is too cool. Later on, you enter a restricted area and find Metroids? Not just the larval ones either. They have incubation tanks housing the different evolutions present in Metroid II, all except the Omega Metroid. Interesting. The SAX breaks in and immediately tries to eradicate the Metroids before being swarmed. Adam is left with no choice but to eject the section, detonating it in the process, thus ending the Federation's Metroid breeding lab, which we are assured was done only for peaceful purposes. Yeah, right. This twist was one I never saw coming my first time, and after playing the previous games, it has more impact than ever before. After all, it was teased in the early portions of the game. Why would the Federation need a replica of the surface of SR-388? Why would Arachnus be here? A boss from Metroid II? This wasn't a callback. This was deliberate. With a threat as dangerous as the X, you'd wonder why the Federation wouldn't tell Samus to leave and blow up the station. It's after speaking with Adam that you find out why. The SAX the Metroids got wasn't acting alone, but now there are no less than 10 of them on the station. The Federation, being frustrated with Samus compromising their plans, intends to trap her in the navigation room until they can procure one for themselves in order to weaponize it for their own use. Samus knows how dangerous this is. The X will infect them, steal their knowledge, and create a threat that could jeopardize the entire solar system. Being trapped in this one room, she's incapable of doing anything to stop this. Samus pleads with the AI, even calling it Adam out of desperation. The AI seems to recognize the name, and immediately begins acting like Adam, including criticizing Samus for her plan, stating it's reckless to throw her own life away for the sake of others. After all, her plan was to simply detonate the BSL station, which would mean the X would still live on the planet's surface. Adam instead decides that they should detonate the station and send it crashing into SR-388, blowing it up in the process. He sets Samus free. The time is now. You're left with one final task: destroy the X parasites for good. Samus reaches the room just before the detonator, but before she can set it off, she's confronted by one of the SAX. You'll be on your toes during this fight as the SAX jumps around and still has more power than you. A few charge shots will weaken it until it mutates into this creepy amalgamation of Samus' suit and the frog creature that the X had originally possessed back during the opening. Though this form doesn't pose much of a threat, as the X is already weakened and goes down without much more of a fight. It flees and Samus sets off the detonator. The familiar countdown begins and you run to your ship, only to notice it's gone. In its place, a familiar shell lays on the floor. I alluded to it earlier, an Omega Metroid jumps on screen and swipes Samus aside without effort. Just as things look grim, the SAX shows up and attempts to defeat the Metroid. It's still too weak from its fight with Samus and is overwhelmed immediately. In an act of self-defense, it allows Samus to absorb it, returning her to her old self and giving her the Ice Beam once more. This doesn't make the fight any easier. After all, you still have the countdown looming over your head. You defeat the Metroid and your ship returns to pick you up. The station collides with SR-388 and explodes, eradicating the X-parasites forever. Samus may have her powers back, but she only adapted her familiar colors. She still looks the same. She's never going to be quite the same after this experience. There's this bit about how apparently Adam's actual intelligence was put into an AI, and I can't buy that. But what I can buy is how Samus' ship was brought back to her. It was done by the creatures from Zebus that taught Samus how to wall jump and shine spark, who wound up in confinement on the BSL station. Samus saved them partway through the adventure and they fled to her ship for safety. You did save them, right? Metroid Fusion chose a route of streamlining the experience. With this decision came the benefits and consequences of it. It lacks the subtext of super storytelling. You can't turn off beams once you get them, or stack them to create interesting results. It's linear and treats it like a plot point. However, it lets you do a new run on the same save file, and it actually tells you how many items you have left to collect in each area. Rooms transition faster than ever before. It's difficult, rarely ever feeling cheap. Most importantly, Metroid Fusion is distinct. It did everything it could to differentiate itself from the rest of the series. It's unique, and thanks to this, it stands out. I can't deny its flaws, but I'll happily look past them knowing I'll have a good time playing it. Up until this year, this was the last point in the Metroid narrative. It took 20 years, but we're finally getting a continuation of its story in Metroid Dread. We're not done yet though. We still have one more game to look at. Next week, we'll be looking at Metroid Zero Mission, a reimagined remake of the original game. For just $1, you can see that episode right now. Until next time, you all take care.